He is the founder of Argonaut Capital. Will you please welcome to talk about energy, Barry Norris?
Well, thank you, Dominic. I did think when I was given the title of the energy transition that people might spend more time than normal in having a coffee, because normally it's normally time to leave the room. But don't worry, this won't be your normal ESG sermon. So in Hans Christian Andersen's fairy tale, The Emperor's New Clothes, a vainglorious emperor is conned by a pair of villainous tailors into parting with sacks of money in exchange for magical clothes. According to the con men, the emperor's magic suit can only be seen by clever people and will be invisible to anybody stupid or anybody who can't do their job properly. Of course, the clothes are truly invisible. They don't exist. But fearing the 19th century version of cancel culture, the people, as well as the emperor, are too afraid to go against the general opinion that the magic suit is magnificent, concerned about revealing themselves to be stupid or incompetent, until a small child watching the emperor's procession shouts out, "The emperor's got no clothes on." Well, I need to warn you that I am that small child when it comes to the energy transition. The current energy transition is, in my opinion, the most important issue in the global economy and therefore for investors. Why are we doing it? The need for this energy transition is based upon a scientific theory that has no null hypothesis and is conveniently ignorant of the long history of dramatic climate change that predates the Industrial Revolution and therefore man-made CO2 emissions. It has been embraced as an apocalyptic religion by polite society and forcibly imposed on all citizens without due democratic process. We were previously told that the energy transition would add rather than subtract from economic growth. We are also reliably informed, as if it could be accurately predicted, that the upside from the energy transition is limiting the average global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade instead of perhaps 3 degrees by 2050, but only if net zero is adopted globally, which we know the rest of the world isn't going to do. To put this into perspective, by the time I finish speaking today, the temperature outside will have risen by this same 1.5 degree net benefit. So my first observation is that the upside from the energy transition is at best uncertain. But more likely, when the decarbonisation of the West fails to produce a measurable change to global climate, the solution, like that of a medieval doctor with his bag of leeches, will inevitably be to administer more medicine whose efficacy can never be measured, locking us in to a green policy doom loop. But far from saving the world for an environmental existential crisis in a cost-free manner, the truth is that this energy transition will undermine our standards of living, our geopolitical power, and ultimately the capitalist system, with no benefit to the environment. Of course, like Ed Miliband, Greta Thunberg, Al Gore, and Jeremy Grantham, I am no climate change scientist. Unlike them, however, and since this is an investment conference, I will keep my remaining comments to observations around the economic impact of this energy transition and its lessons for investors. I want to talk about 5 things. What does a successful energy transition look like? How is this energy transition different? Is the intermittent electron either cheap or useful? What are the investment opportunities? And how should an ethical investor approach the energy transition? It is often said that a contrarian mindset is essential to successful investing. Jesse Livermore, who briefly became the richest man in the world during the 1929 Wall Street crash, trading only his own self-made capital, observed, "People want the safety of human company. They are afraid to stand alone because they want to be safely included within the herd, not to be the lone calf standing on the desolate, dangerous, wolf-patrolled prairie of contrary opinion." I invite you to join me on this wolf-patrolled prairie of contrary opinion today. So what does a successful energy transition look like? We need to start by understanding what life without fossil fuels look like and what constitutes a successful energy transition. Before fossil fuels, life in pre-industrial Britain had changed little for the better since the Romans had left 1200 years previously. Life expectancy, standard of living and stature were no higher than in the days of Julius Caesar. Energy was provided by what today we call renewables: wood, charcoal, straw, and most importantly, dried dung, and weather-dependent mechanical power in the form of wind and water mills. Most work was done by humans, horses, and oxen. Travel was by sail, horse, and foot. People were tied to the land. There wasn't enough surplus energy for the large-scale urbanization or to sustain more than 4 million people in England. It was called the Dark Ages for a reason. There wasn't a lot of cheap and reliable energy, which meant it was dark. Then, in response to dwindling forest resources, Elizabethan England switched to burning coal, marking the first significant energy transition. Coal's energy density, or bang for buck heat generation, was much higher than wood. It could also be more easily transported. It quickly became the fuel of choice for domestic heating, as well as energy-intensive industries like salt production, brewing beer, and iron manufacturing, which could now be done on a bigger scale. Britain became great by embracing fossil fuels. Coal went from 15% of the UK's primary energy in 1600 to 50% by 1650, 77% by 1800, and by 1850, 91%. Human and animal labour was over 50% of energy consumption in 1600, but only 7% by 1850. Coal energy freed up time and resources for other economic activities. By 1750, the UK population was 6 million. By 1850, it was 18 million, 4.5 times the population before coal started to be used widely in 1600. Yet unlike pre-industrial times, real incomes rose from just over £1,000 in 1600 to just under 3,000 by 1850. At the beginning of the 19th century, Britain's industrial revolution accelerated with the invention of the steam engine, which converted coal's compact chemical energy into reliable mechanical energy, transforming manufacturing through the belt drive and the construction industry through mechanical pile drivers and excavators. By 1865, the economist William Jevons proclaimed that with coal, almost any feat is possible or easy. Without it, we are thrown back into the laborious poverty of early times. The steam engine revolutionized travel through the building of the first national railway network in the 1840s, and then with steamships replacing sail. Britain's Royal Navy ruled the waves, which facilitated the globalization of trade and the abolition of slavery. But energy transitions and geopolitical power are inextricably linked. Coal, the steam engine, and the British hegemony of the 18th and 19th century was to be supplanted in the 20th century by America through the discovery and commercialization of a superior fossil fuel, oil. America's search for oil was initially motivated by the growing scarcity of whale oil for use in lighting and soap. If coal saved the British forest, oil saved the whale. Capitalism saved rather than destroyed the environment. The US oil boom began in Pennsylvania in 1859. By 1880, the US produced 85% of the world's oil. By the 1880s, the first internal combustion engines using refined oil products, gasoline, diesel, kerosene, which had even higher energy density than coal and were cleaner to burn and easier to move and store, replaced steamships, first in shipping, then in trains. Crude oil has been an incredibly flexible source of energy. Its different properties could be isolated by refining and used for a variety of different purposes: lubricants, asphalt, synthetic fibres, paints, coatings, detergents, pesticides, resins and adhesives. Near the end of the 19th century, more powerful and efficient coal-fired steam engines began to be replaced by an energy which was more reliable, clean and efficient, silent and adjustable, electricity. The first of many world-changing uses of electricity was the light bulb in 1879, which was 100 times brighter than candles. It is often forgotten that gasoline cars accounted for only 22% of cars produced in 1900, compared with coal steamer cars at 40% and electric cars at 38%. None of these could match the power-to-weight ratio of internal combustion engines powered by gasoline or diesel, their economy, their range, or ease of manufacture. Cars powered by refined oil proved superior then, and for the same reasons they still are. So the Industrial Revolution, of which Britain was the earliest pioneer, substituted renewable energy with fossil fuels, replaced animal and human labour with electricity and internal combustion engines. Within just a few generations, it created an entirely new world, which was indisputably a better world. We use 20 times more energy per capita today than in 1650. The real costs of energy have fallen by 90% over the same period. This is the main cause of our living standards, as defined by GDP per capita, rising by 30 times. Pre-industrial economies had 80% of their population employed in agriculture. By 1861, England had 21, and it's 1% today. With our utilisation of mechanised farming equipment and fertilisers and pesticides derived from fossil fuels, since 1800, the human labour needing to produce a kilogram of wheat was reduced from 10 minutes to less than 2 seconds. This has freed up the rest of the population, who seem to have forgotten what fossil fuels have done for them. In terms of physical labour, our embrace of fossil fuels means that the average person today in the UK has the equivalent of 250 people working for them non-stop, day and night, without complaint. Today, fossil fuels still represent over 85% of our primary energy consumption and are essential in the production of plastic, steel, cement, nitrogen, fertilizer, and silicon, which are the material basis of our civilization. Without the cheap and reliable energy brought by fossil fuels, we would all have to re-embrace agrarian living, like Tom and Barbara from the 1970s sitcom The Good Life, and we would all struggle to produce enough food for Britain's extra 62 million people. Who really wants to go back to living like that? So how is this energy transition different? Well, previous energy transitions have seen market forces support the triumph of an economically superior product. During the Industrial Revolution, coal replaced wood, dry dung and wind as the dominant fuels. In the 20th century, oil replaced coal, and in the 1990s, North Sea gas replaced coal as the main source of UK electricity generation. A more natural evolution might see nuclear, which has more bang for buck energy density, if not yet lower cost or ease of use, eventually replace fossil fuels. But instead, for the first time in the history of human civilization, we are seeking to replace a superior source of energy with an inferior product, which have been discarded by previous generations. The prime motivation for this energy transition is unique in history. It is not economic, but instead ideological, or more accurately, quasi-religious. The demonization of CO2, a clear and odorless gas which makes up 4 basis points of the Earth's atmosphere and which is essential for plant photosynthesis. Since the free market would never embrace an economic inferior product, this transition requires constant government subsidy and coercion against fossil fuel alternatives to ensure the survival of the unfittest. Government involvement in previous energy transition was limited. Although the Elizabethan government passed various laws protecting the British forest, the use of coal and steam engines in Britain developed without government support. There was no 19th century American subsidy of the nascent oil industry. Whaling was not outlawed in the US until 1971. At the beginning of the 20th century, governments didn't try to pick winners between electrical, coal, and gasoline or diesel-powered cars. There are now free energy transition policy commitments in the UK. A renewable grid by 2030, previously 2035 under the last government. A European-wide ban on new non-electric car sales by 2035. And for those who either still believe in fairies or unicorns or want to re-embrace pre-industrial standards of living, net zero by 2050, now enshrined in law since 2019 via a parliamentary debate which lasted just 17 minutes. It is worth remembering that the electricity grid currently still powers less than 20% of total UK final energy consumption, 80% of which is reliant on fossil fuels. Net zero, therefore, must involve electrifying all economic activity, manufacturing, agriculture, transportation, home heating, forcing consumers to change their behaviour, relying on products that haven't yet been invented and probably won't be unless the laws of physics and chemistry change. As we will see, all of this would be powered by a dysfunctional electricity grid that only works when the wind blows, requiring a blank cheque of taxpayer or consumer subsidy. Even if full electrification could be achieved, a mere doubling of the planned electricity generation would appear to imply that per capita primary energy consumption would need to fall by at least 60% to reach net zero, presumably with a commensurate fall in standards of living. Under such an economic scenario, not only will stock market returns be disastrous, but it is unlikely that the capitalist system, including private property, will continue to exist. UK electricity consumption has already declined by 20% since 2005, owing to high prices and deindustrialisation, and our total energy consumption is down 30%, now at levels last seen in the 1950s. Is it any wonder that UK GDP per capita continues to decline whilst those countries which still embrace cheap and reliable energy, such as the US, China and India, power ahead? Although politicians of all creeds in the UK have demonstrated little understanding of how a power grid works, leading to breathtaking ignorance about the cost and feasibility of the energy transition, new Energy Minister Ed Miliband combines an unusual degree of economic illiteracy with the zeal of a man who has just found his calling through membership of an apocalyptic cult. Only government intervention could result in so much of the nation's resources being reallocated so unproductively. As former US President Ronald Reagan once put it, the 9 most terrifying words in the English language are, "I'm from the government and I'm here to help." Is the intermittent electron either cheap or useful? Let's examine how UK wind producers are incentivised. There are almost no offshore wind projects in the UK currently operating in the free market without subsidy, guaranteed prices for their output, or above market private power agreements. Over the last decade, the UK government has allocated new wind production capacity to the wind industry via its annual CFD auction, which has set a guaranteed price for wind farm output. The CFD auction process misleads the public, since headline prices are quoted in 2012 levels and prices are automatically adjusted higher each year by inflation and grid costs for the 15 years of the contract, which only starts when the wind farm starts producing power. This means, for instance, that the CFD awarded in 2014 at £140 per megawatt hour is actually now worth 40% more already at £196. This is 4 times the current cost of gas-powered electricity generation at £45 to £50 per megawatt hour before carbon taxes. As we shall see, the guaranteed price insures wind operators against the fatal defect of intermittency, whilst the upwards-only annual price revisions protect against inflation. The wind industry and UK politicians previously made silly claims about the wind power's cost competitiveness relative to gas based on the decline in headline CFD auction prices from £140 in 2014 to just £37 in 2022. But last year, in an embarrassing backtrack from previous claims that offshore wind was the cheapest form of energy, wind developers refused to bid for new projects unless they were awarded higher guaranteed prices. In a shabby backroom bailout, the UK government agreed to adjust some of the previously agreed contracts, and they raised the 2024 CFD price to a headline of £75 per megawatt hour, which adjusted for inflation, remember these are 2012 prices, are already worth £100 per megawatt hour today, more than twice the cost of gas generation. The wind industry is now strangely silent about wind being cheap. Once again, our politicians have been duped by green grifters, with the bill settled by UK consumers. But this is what happens when governments, rather than the free market, are allowed to pick winners and allocate capital. While some will argue that a premium for carbon-free power is a price worth paying, there is no defence when the debate turns to the usefulness of intermittent wind power. There is no price worth paying for something which is economically useless, and I say more wind power is useless. My research has broken down wind market share and spot system power prices since 2019, examining over 100,000 half-an-hour discrete time periods. We see how UK wind market share has regularly oscillated between 0% and 60% market share in 30 minutes, depending on the weather. As with all commodities, the market price is set by the marginal cost of switching on supply to meet demand. So when the wind doesn't blow, the grid must bid up supply from producers of reliable dispatchable power, gas, nuclear, hydro, coal, biomass, to match supply with demand to avoid blackouts. Conversely, when there is too much supply of wind power that cannot be used or stored, the grid makes low or even negative bids to discourage this production. This means that as the UK increases its wind generation, wind market share will become even more volatile, leading to more volatile power prices, which increases grid costs as dispatchable power must ramp up and down to compensate for wind volatility. Excluding the immediate aftermath of the Russian invasion of Ukraine when the gas price temporarily spiked, wind market share, or rather the weather, in these 100,000 discrete 30-minute time periods is now the biggest determinant of the price of UK power. Since when the wind is blowing in the North Sea, it's usually blowing in the Irish Sea, this fundamental problem cannot be overcome by installing more wind turbines. On windy days, Britain already has a glut of electricity, which cannot be consumed, stored since large batteries remain cripply uneconomic, or exported, since the rest of Europe also experiences simultaneous windy day gluts. The Saudi Arabia of wind is perhaps one of the dumbest business models of all time. If when the wind blows, its current market share is 60%, think about the plans to install 3 or 4 times as much wind capacity as we have now in the future. We will just have even more frequent periods of very low or even negative power prices, reflecting wasteful economic activity that UK consumers pay for. The companies building these monstrous offshore wind farms, nowadays often the size of Greater London, just don't care because that their product is largely useless, since the government has already guaranteed them a price for their output, funded by electricity bills for UK consumers. This is crony capitalism shielded behind a sanctimonious ESG cloak. This monumental misallocation of capital would not happen in a free market, but only occurs because the UK government guarantees a price for wind power, irrespective of whether there is an economic use for the power produced. Total Energy's CEO, whose company has invested billions in wind projects, recently stated that in isolation, in my view, at anything other than low market shares, green intermittent electrons have little or no value. Let me explain this through an analogy. The power grid is like a factory which always needs to be manned. In this analogy, nuclear power is the expensive worker who never clocks off. Gas power is the flexible worker who can be relied upon to turn up when needed, whilst wind power is the unreliable worker who calls in sick more often than they turn up. New factory owner Ed Miliband now proposes to ditch all gas power by 2030, sacking all the flexible gas workers, replacing them with either more expensive inflexible nuclear workers or those additional wind workers who now guarantee to only turn up when they're not needed. Without the flexible gas worker, the factory owner is unable to respond either to the volatility of demand or supply of unreliable workers. So it ends up either needing to overinvest in the expensive inflexible nuclear workers or in general employ far more workers overall than needed with no guarantee of being consistently adequately resourced. The cost of this duplication of resource in building a renewable grid is of course passed on to British consumers through higher electricity bills. The UK grid will attempt to compensate for the loss of gas by burning more wood, which is an even higher negative environmental impact than coal. It is unrealistic to expect large-scale deployment of new nuclear by 2029, even new generation small modular reactors. Replacing coal as a reliable worker, cleaner gas turbine generation increased from just 5% of the UK grid in 1990 to 40% in 2021. With gas, the UK could have both decarbonisation, emissions fell by 44% over the same period, and economic growth, which rose 76%. The tragedy and the stupidity of net zero, and putting it into statute, is that it effectively outlaws gas, which remains the only viable energy choice facilitating both decarbonisation and economic growth. Until renewable power companies are made to pay for the costs of their own intermittency, they have no jeopardy to force them into making rational economic decisions that are in the wider economic interest, such as delaying further production capacity until after breakthroughs in storage technology, if indeed such breakthroughs are feasible. The renewable grid envisaged by the Labour government in 2030 will produce abundant electricity for a few days annually and prohibitively expensive unreliable power for the rest of the time, requiring a blank cheque of consumer subsidy, resulting in demand destruction, supply rationing and deindustrialisation. Now, many of you will remember or may remember on the morning of the 1992 general election, the Sun newspaper front page famously warned its readers that if Kinnock wins today, will the last person to leave Britain please turn out the lights? Well, by the time we get round to the next election in 2029, unlike in 1992, we may not need to worry about turning off the lights. Let's now think about where are the investment opportunities. Perhaps it would be easier to start with what to avoid. Matt Ridley, eminent scientist, author and member of the House of Lords, recently tweeted, "Don't expect industry to tell the truth about the impossibility of the transition. To paraphrase Gulliver's Travels, if you ask business to make sunbeams from cucumbers, they would have a crack at it and only tell you it was impossible after spending $1 billion of your money." So there are scams facilitated by victims ideologically opposed to the sun but needing sunbeams. At higher shares of wind power, electricity will need to be stored over weeks and months, not days and hours. But current battery technology is unable to offer an industrial scale solution for longer than a few hours. The building of the world's largest lithium-ion industrial battery in Trafford, Manchester, recently hit the headlines. Costing £750 million, the battery would store 1 gigawatt for 2 hours, enough to power Britain's grid for 3 minutes and 17 seconds. The business model for battery storage takes advantage of very short-term fluctuations in power prices, which will increase as the power price is made more volatile by the energy transition. It is yet another green grifter industry earning an economic rent from UK consumers. Net zero disciples continue to advocate that Britain plough on regardless and continue to overbuild wind in the hope that surplus energy generated on windy days can in future be efficiently exported or stored over useful time periods in a cost-effective, scalable manner. So we are fed a narrative of miraculous technological breakthroughs in storage. The reality is that human ingenuity can innovate, but the rules of chemistry and physics don't change. Hydrogen is the latest unfeasible storage fad touted to justify wind overbuild. Expensive industrial electrolyzers would have to operate at very low capacity utilization given the intermittency of renewable energy, which is why weather-dependent hydrogen will never be cost competitive. Hydrogen is also extremely flammable and difficult to store. It must be chilled to minus 253 degrees Celsius to liquefy and safely transport, with the energy subject to high losses on conversion, meaning it is a complete waste of time. The capacity of the storage battery to attract fraudsters was recognized at the birth of electricity. Thomas Edison, Mr. Electricity, wrote in 1883, "The storage battery is, in my opinion, a catchpenny, a sensation, a mechanism for swindling the public by stock companies. The storage battery is one of those peculiar things which appeals to the imagination. And no more perfect thing could be desired by stock swindlers. Just as soon as a man gets working on the secondary battery, it brings out his latent capacity for lying." Now, an alien investor just landed on Earth might think an industry such as wind power, which is so heavily subsidized to the detriment of consumers, given regulatory support, including the coercion of competitors through carbon taxes and forcing on those competitors higher grid costs, must be a nirvana for shareholder profits. But the fact is that there are some products that are so inherently inferior that even after government's best efforts, they fail to generate adequate profits for investors. If you cannot make a profit in the free market, then you are not sustainable in the true sense of the word. This is why the energy transition is failing and will fail. The wind industry wouldn't exist without government subsidy and may still fail despite it. The miraculous drop in UK CFD prices from 2017 throws into doubt the economic viability of all offshore wind projects built in the UK since then on significantly lower CFD prices. Wind turbine manufacturers claim their turbines last 15 to 20 years. We think that the average life of the wind turbine is half of this, which makes a significant difference to the profitability of a wind project, particularly when that project is typically loaded with debt. Legacy subsidies that allow older projects to operate at 3 times the market price have incentivized wind operators to maintain their old fleets with very high OPEX. But as less generously subsidized vintages become a higher proportion of the overall turbine fleet, we are witnessing turbine manufacturers incurring higher warranty and service costs for unreliable turbines. And this problem is most acute in the harsher offshore environment, and that dealing with this hidden liability will be a nasty surprise for equity investors. Then there is the problem of cheaper Chinese competition. China has become a conduit for Europe to move its CO2 emissions off balance sheet. It can efficiently manufacture, powered by coal-fired electricity, the polysilicon for solar cells and smelt the lithium for EV batteries. China will also, through its mercantilist business model, which does not require its companies to make a profit, only create employment and earn foreign exchange, dominate energy transition industries, putting its Western competitors out of business. The European economy grew by 15% in dollar terms over the last 15 years, compared to 82% for the US. The average EU country is now poorer than every US state except Idaho and Mississippi. At the time of the financial crisis in 2008, standards of living in the US, UK, France, and Germany were roughly comparable. Since then, whilst GDP per capita in the US has risen from $48,000 to $78,000, we have seen zero advancement in Western Europe. In fact, the only successful energy transition of recent times has been in America. It's the shale oil revolution, which began in 2008 and is now responsible for 64% of all US crude production and 78% of all natural gas production, re-establishing the US as the world's top oil and gas producer. Whereas through embracing shale, the US has an abundance of cheap and reliable energy, according to a recently published report by EU super technocrat Mario Draghi, the solution to EU economic stagnation is that Brussels bureaucrats be allocated 800 billion euros a year to pick winners in green technology, doubling down on what doesn't work. It really beggars belief. Europe's climate change piety has resulted in it not only banning sales of non-electric cars from 2035, but also from 2025 and then again in 2030, imposing increasingly penal fines on its car makers for the manufacture of non-electric cars. The logical consequence of this is that the EU's car industry, like the UK car industry before it, will cease to be mass market, resulting in a hollowing out of Europe's industrial base. Now, the AI revolution is something of a game changer for power markets in that companies with balance sheets as big as government are building AI data centers that need robust solutions than an unreliable public power grid, which cannot be powered 24/7 by intermittent energy PPAs, so are privately making superior capital allocation decisions to government. Now, unlike government, these private companies are recognizing economic reality by paying a premium, not a discount, for reliable dispatchable power. Microsoft recently announced that it had done a deal with US utility Constellation to restart the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant to power its data centers, paying $110 per megawatt hour, roughly double the average US grid price. To put demand from power from AI data centers into context, a 1 gigawatt data center would consume about 3% of UK annual electricity supply. OpenAI is talking about building 5 gigawatt data centers. So if all of Britain's electricity were used to exclusively power 5 gigawatt data centers, Britain could manage to power just 6.5. With the highest electricity prices in the world, according to a recent report by the IEA, some 80% above median developed world and 3 times those in the US, the UK is sadly unlikely to benefit from the AI revolution. Google has said it is currently looking at small modular reactors, but the problem with nuclear is that there is currently not enough spare capacity to reallocate from the grid to data centers. And although SMR technology is proven in submarines, the estimates for cost delivery are still uncertain, and the first SMRs will likely not see service until the early 2030s. And this is too long to wait in the AI arms race. So as that most famous master of inference, Sherlock Holmes, famously concluded, when you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth. And this is true when finding sound investment ideas from this energy transition. Therefore, however improbable, the truth is that our economic future must involve re-embracing gas, our flexible grid worker, with at least half the CO2 emissions of wood and coal, which at least in the US is found in abundance and at by far the cheapest price per energy per unit. So Henry Hub gas in the US currently trades at $2.7 per gigajoule, and that is compared to European TTF gas, which of course we import at $10.50 per gigajoule, and crude oil at $14 per gigajoule. So if you're looking for sound energy investments, I suggest focusing on gas turbine manufacturers, US gas pipeline companies able to directly connect data centers to shale fields, and shale gas operators and drillers. Who knows, this might even catch on in Europe eventually. How should an ethical investor approach the energy transition? Well, through the environmental, social and governance movement, institutional fund managers have been coaxed and coerced into supporting a half-baked political agenda. Beyond net zero, the ESG agenda, which has never and can never be properly defined, expands relentlessly to any and every other trendy political issue of the day. It is also unclear who is defining this agenda and to whom they are accountable. As the economist Milton Friedman pointed out, the responsibility of business is to make as much money as possible within the rules of society. Those rules should be set by a democratic parliament, not some unaccountable nomenclature who, like a youthful cadre of Maoist Red Guards, exercise their ESG tyranny across corporations and financial institutions. The logical endgame of compulsory ESG is that all public capital is allocated not primarily for profit, but according to the political values of organizations which are not democratically accountable. This sounds to me like the way communist economies work, with so far zero examples of economic success. There is no legal basis for an investment manager to prioritize moral or ethical considerations over financial performance on an ad hoc, subjective and arbitrary basis. Excluding stocks solely based on non-economic factors can never result in higher returns because a smaller universe will always lead to fewer opportunities. Indeed, this goes against an investment manager's core fiduciary duty as the agent of investors to act in their economic best interests. As soon as profit is displaced by non-pecuniary factors, capital gets repurposed for non-economic projects, which become a drag on productivity and economic growth. Whilst capitalism rightly creates winners and losers through an efficient allocation of resources, the alternative created by ESG investment is a stagnant command economy where no one wins. Far from creating wealth and doing good, ESG will destroy societies through an absence of economic growth that would inevitably come with the neglect of the profit motive. Government has recently shown a revived appetite to compete with companies and investors in allocating capital. Although the historic track record of state industrial policy in picking winners is patchy, the record of loser companies requiring endless taxpayer support picking government is exemplary. Everywhere and always, the energy transition seeks to replace an economically superior with an inferior product. Consequently, it requires unsustainable exogenous factors to sustain it. Free capital from zero interest rates and ESG investing, government subsidies which reallocate capital from the productive to the unproductive economy and is therefore not scalable, and a command economy coercion which bans everything that already exists which is more useful. We have forgotten that profit has been the greatest motivation known to mankind to allocate finite resources productively, that capitalism is inherently meritocratic because its survival instincts require the best talent and optimal resources, and that no society can have sustainable economic growth without profit growth that increases the capital base of the economy for future productive reinvestment and ensures the Darwinian survival of best ideas in an evolution of civilization. Profit must therefore be the central tenet of ethical investing. As the infamous fictional corporate raider Gordon Gekko succinctly put it in the 1987 movie Wall Street, the point is, ladies and gentlemen, greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works. Greed clarifies, cuts through, and captures the essence of the evolutionary spirit. Greed in all its forms, greed for life, money, love, knowledge, has marked the upward surge of mankind. And it is the pursuit of profit, not ESG or the energy transition, to paraphrase Gekko, that will not only save our stock market, but that other malfunctioning corporation called the UK. Thank you.